good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Revolutionizing Healthcare. This is our first session of 2026, so welcome back and thank you for continuing to be part of this community. And a big welcome to those of you joining us today. It's also our first session under our new format, as we shared earlier this year. Instead of running monthly 1-hour seminars, we're moving to longer 2-hour seminars designed to allow more depth, more discussion, and a space where clinicians and researchers can openly discuss clinical challenges, exploring emerging ideas, and shape future research directions together. And in saying that, please stay muted until the end where we have the question section, but we heavily encourage you to post questions at any point in the Q&A box within Zoom. And please feel free to upvote others' queries, and we'll pick them up during the discussion session at the end. And today's session is on how AI can help de-risk and improve clinical trials, from drug development to trial design, recruitment, and more. And today's session is particularly exciting as it builds directly from Professor Michaela van der Schaar's new white paper, Clinical Trials as Continuously Learning Systems, which was released last week, and we'll hear from her very soon. But before we begin, I'll go through the rough schedule for today's session. So the session will go for about 2 hours. The beginning will be a bit of a general intro. This will be covered by Michaela van der Schaar. Then we'll be moving on towards the panel statements from our wonderful panelists, whom I'll now introduce in a moment. Then we'll have our core panel discussions. Then we'll have the audience questions and answers, where we'd love to hear from you. And then we'll be wrapping it up at the end. And just to reiterate for any of you who joined just recently, please put your questions in the Q&A chat and upvote the most important queries. And now I'm very pleased to briefly introduce all of our panelists. We're fortunate to have a group that spans statistics, pharmacology, neurology, medicine, and industry, which is exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary perspective this topic requires. First of all, we have Dr. Justine Rochon, Head of R&D Data and Quantitative Sciences at Takeda. Professor Eoin McKinney, Professor in Medicine at the University of Cambridge and a CCA faculty. Dr. Anders Boyd, Team Lead Biostatisticians with affiliations at the University of Bern and Amsterdam UMC. We'll have Dr. Tracy Glass-Jans, Co-Head Clinical Statistics and Data Management Group, Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, as well as an Associate Professor at University of Basel. Following that, we have Professor Parashkev Nachev, Professor of Neurology at the University College London, and finally, Professor Richard Peck, Honorary Professor at the University of Liverpool and also a CCM faculty. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And now it's my very pleasure to hand it over to Professor Michaela van der Schaar.
Thank you very much, Marika, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for being here, especially to the panelists. Thank you so much for all your help in preparing this presentation. So today I would like to talk about a simple idea. What if clinical trials were designed and managed as continuously learning systems? At present, clinical development still operates largely as a sequence of episodic decisions, and evidence accumulates over time, but the reasoning that connects this evidence across the different phases, programs, and risk dimensions remains somewhat fragmented. And this creates a structural problem. So the proposal that I'd like to put forward here and discuss with you is not a new trial design and not a change on the regulatory landscape, but rather a multi-agent decision intelligence framework using AI that can operate over a shared causal digital twin. And this is designed to enable clinical trials and more generally clinical development to function as a continuously learning system that is proactively identifying and mitigating development risks across the entire life cycle. A brief outline of the presentation, I would like to describe the core problem, which many of you are very familiar with, then talk about the opportunity of de-risking trials using AI. I will then introduce very briefly what I mean by digital twins, what digital twins I'm proposing and their role in this framework, how AI agents can use these digital twins to de-risk the clinical development and what type of agents do we need, how the framework can be used in practice, both for upfront de-risking but also for continuous de-risking as the trial is ongoing. I'm going to say a few words about data use and trial integrity, and then finally a few words about why this is a novel idea, but also hopefully discuss with you about impact and possible collaborations. And again, I put forward a white paper that presents some of these ideas, and I'm very thankful to everyone that has helped me sharpen these ideas, and I hope for continuous discussion with the community on this paper. So if you have not seen it, please download it and take a look, and I apologize that it is somewhat long. So what are really the issues associated with trial failures? And you are all very familiar with that. So many trial failures are not purely scientific failures. They are decision failures arising from incomplete or imperfect reasoning in the developmental process. We have, for instance, informational failures that occur when the trial does not generate the evidence needed for confident decisions. We have therapeutic failures that arise when biological assumptions, for instance, underlying treatment effectiveness do not hold across patient populations or disease stages or combination contexts. And we have relevance failures, which are even more interesting because they occur when if a trial, even though was scientifically valid, the results arrive into a therapeutic or competitive landscape that has already evolved and reduced the clinical or strategic value of the evidence. So the central argument of this discussion is that many of these failure modes are predictable earlier than we currently detect them, and that we can possibly mitigate them using new advances in AI. So the key issues is not only that failures occur, but that our reasoning about risk is fundamentally imperfect and also fragmented. We have biological, statistical, operational, regulatory, and competitive risks, and they are all interacting strongly. Yet they are typically analyzed, as I mentioned before, separately and at different moments in the developmental process. And as evidence accumulates continuously, it is a missed opportunity not to inform our decision process from this information. So as a result, insights from earlier trials, but also parallel programs, real-world data, are only partially integrated, and they limit our ability to anticipate downstream risk. And this motivates the need for life cycle level reasoning systems across the entire clinical trial that continuously can integrate evidence and jointly evaluate interacting uncertainties across the full developmental trajectory. Now, the opportunity here is to use AI to de-risk clinical trials, and my proposal is briefly highlighted here, and it is to create a continuously updated digital twin of the trial and its surrounding ecosystem, and I will say more about this digital twin in a little bit, and then to connect it to a network of specialized agents, biological, statistical, operational, regulatory, and competitive agents, which together perform continuous cross-risk reasoning, allowing assumptions to be tested, re-evaluated, and stress-tested as evidence accumulates. So, in essence, the framework turns development from a sequence of decisions into a continuous learning, reasoning, and de-risking process. Now, why decision-oriented twins change this strategy and why I believe that having a powerful set of digital twins is essential. Well, these digital twins can integrate real-world data, historical trial knowledge, as well as ongoing blinded operational signals, as well as external scientific and competitive developments to generate, and I'd like to highlight here, generate rather than predict. So we do more than prediction, we can generate plausible future trajectories and how these trajectories are possibly changing under interventions. So this will enable us early detection of fragile assumptions, stress testing in different ways of trial designs before real implementation, as well as the trial is ongoing, continuous de-risking as evidence accumulates. So the result are clinical trials which evolve from static experiments into a continuously learning system. And for that, the key capabilities of these digital twins are to generate these future trajectories under alternative interventions and policies, to continuously learn, as well as reflect uncertainty associated with this generation. I'm also talking here about not ordinary digital twins, but other decision level reasoning digital twins, which enables us to really provide accuracy that's necessary for make decisions by the different agents. Now, I'm talking about not one type of digital twin, but rather multiple types of digital twins. And here I'm highlighting them and briefly the questions they answer. So we have patient-level digital twins, which model disease trajectories and individualized treatment response heterogeneity, and are able to answer questions such as what happens to different patient populations under different types of therapies or different types of dose. And these are just examples of what a digital twin can provide. Again, I'm talking here about generation rather than prediction. More complicated, but necessary task. We have also operational twins, which can model recruitment, adherence, site performance, or execution variability. And with that, we can answer questions such as how will trial execution unfold in practice? Trial level twins, which can model projected information accrual, event rates, power, and bias risk. And this combine inputs from both patient-level digital twins as well as operational digital twins with protocol specification and historical design, as well as ongoing performance data. They can answer questions such as what evidence will this trial design actually produce? And ecosystem twins, which can model competing pipeline standards of care or regulatory timelines. And questions such as will results remain clinically relevant when available? Now, if you want to read more about how to build AI-enabled digital twins and how such twins are built, and see some of the machine learning work that we have put forward in this direction, I invite you to take a look at this website. We also have an associating engagement session where we describe some of the key ideas. Now, on top of these digital twins, we have AI agents which are taking this information and making powerful recommendations to human stakeholders. And AI agents are not just AI models. While they are based on a powerful Gen AI, such as large language models, they are going way beyond that. An AI agent is a system that can use existing tools as well as build new tools to do analysis and in different types of domains. Reason about the available knowledge that gets accumulated, learn continuously from their interactions, determine and evaluate complex policies or strategies, and communicate with other agents to gather evidence as well as human stakeholders. And these are just some of the few things that AI agents can do. In this framework, each agent will represent a distinct development perspective. The agents will interact, will challenge each other, will challenge assumptions, and coordinate their decisions, providing recommendation to human stakeholders. They will learn continuously also as evidence evolves. And there are 5 types of agents that are going to be involved in this framework. The biological agent will continuously evaluate whether the fundamental scientific assumptions of the trial remain valid, and using the causal biological digital twins that will integrate mechanistic, biomarker, and clinical evidence, they can monitor treatment effect heterogeneity, they can look at emerging resistance mechanism, they can look at subgroup instability as new data accumulates. And when biological assumptions begin to weaken, the agent can prospectively evaluate alternative strategies, such as, for instance, enrichment, dosing, sequencing, or combination approaches, allowing developmental teams to anticipate biological risks rather than react to late-stage failures. So in short, this agent provides continuous biological risk intelligence, ensuring that the program remains aligned with the evolving science throughout the trial. The statistical agents are continuously evaluating whether the trial remains inferentially credible as it evolves, and it monitors how enrollment dynamics, protocol deviations, subgroup decompositions, and operational variability affect power, precision, identifiability, and generalizability of the trial. And using the digital twin, the agents will assess alternative designs or evidence generation strategies and quantify how these choices will influence uncertainty and robustness of treatment effect estimations. So the role of this agent is not to change prescribed statistical procedures, but to provide early warnings when inferential assumptions become fragile and to prospectively evaluate mitigation strategies. Now, the operational agent is another type of agent which will focus on whether the trial can be executed as intended and whether execution dynamics begin to threaten evidential goals. And using scenario simulation based on the digital twins, the agent will evaluate potential interventions such as site reallocation, recruitment targeting, or potential follow-up optimization, and will estimate how these changes would affect timelines, subgroup balance, and in conversation with the statistical agent, for instance, statistical power. So in this way, the operational execution will become proactively managed rather than reactively corrected, ensuring that feasibility assumptions remain aligned with the evidence. The regulatory agent focuses on maintaining evidentiary credibility and regulatory alignment throughout the development cycle, and its role is not to change the regulatory process, but rather to continuously evaluate whether evolving trial designs, protocol adaptations, enrichment strategies, or evidence generation choices remain consistent with regulatory acceptable standards. And by analyzing precedents or historical approval patterns, the agent will anticipate whether regulatory expectations may shift and highlight when additional evidence or alternative endpoints or modified strategies could strengthen the approval positioning. Now, the competitive agent will evaluate whether a trial remains clinically and strategically relevant in a rapidly changing therapeutic landscape. Even scientifically valid trials can lose their impact if competitors introduce new drugs or standards of care change. And this agent, therefore, will continuously monitor emerging therapies, market dynamics, scientific advances, and anticipate how the positioning of the program may change over time. It can evaluate alternative strategies under these competitive scenarios, helping developmental teams ensure that the evidence generated will still be decision relevant at the moment of the trial completion. Now, how this framework can be used in practice? Before trial launch, the framework can stress test the full strategy and the end-to-end strategic framework using patient, observational, operational, trial, and ecosystem digital twins. And the objective is not only to estimate probability of success, but rather to identify fragile assumptions, hidden dependencies, and avoid failures. Once the trial begins, then the same system can move into continuous de-risking, and as operational signals, outcomes, and external scientific developments emerge, the digital twins will update and the agents will reevaluate the remaining stages of the development. And this will allow hopefully early detection of assumption breakdowns and will enable principal pivots evaluated jointly by the agents. In short, the framework transforms these trials from static experiments into an AI-assisted continuous learning, reasoning, and decision system that can proactively shape success conditions. What the framework does not change, it does preserve the statistical rigor by not replacing pre-specified estimates, statistical analysis, plans, or accepted methods. Any adaptive features remain governed by prospectively defined and approved operating characteristics. The regulatory and governance structures are preserved. So we don't propose here to modify regulatory approval pathways, ethics oversights, or protocol authority. It provides decision support rather than decision automation to all the stakeholders involved in the trial. Important note here about data use and trial strategy is that the framework is designed to preserve blinding, statistical validity, and regulatory compliance. Thereby, it only uses historical trials, external data sets, mechanistic knowledge, and real-world data and available evidence to construct the initial digital twins. And then, as the trial is ongoing, we will only have access to operational recruitment metrics, data quality and execution signals, blinded or pooled outcome summaries only. There will be no access to treatment level unblinded data. So why this is new in conclusion? Because we move from static protocol optimization to lifecycle decision intelligence provided by AI. We move from a fragmented risk assessment to an explicit joint modeling of biological, statistical, operational, regulatory, and competitive risk. From isolated analysis to a multi-agent reasoning over a shared causal digital twin. From learning from individual trials to learning across programs and therapeutic areas. And this hopefully will enable earlier detection of avoidable failures, more robust and adaptive development strategies, faster evidence learning cycles across clinical development, and trials that remain scientifically credible and operationally feasible while providing clinical relevance under changing conditions. So the vision is clinical trials evolving from episodic experiments into these continuously learning decision systems. I hope that this will provide some food for thought, some food for debate, and I look forward to discuss with the panelists today, but more generally with everyone interested in this area. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mihaela. I believe now we will start with the panel statements. So if we would like to get the panelists to provide a short introduction of themselves and a short statement about today's topic, starting with Justine, if that's all right.
Sure, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I come to this topic as both a statistician and a psychologist with more than 20 years of experience in drug development across academia and industry. And right now I work in industry, as you introduced myself already. So what I really like about the approach described in the white paper is that it reframes the risking from a one-time design exercise into a continuous learning system that really integrates multiple dimensions of drug development. And I have to say, I consider myself as a drug developer with the background I just talked about. And it reminds me a little bit what I read, about a quote often attributed to Marie Curie Skłodowska: the more we understand, the less we fear. So now, from a psychology perspective and lens, the biggest opportunity I see here is better decision making under uncertainty. I think we do not live in a world, full of fully calculated risks. In drug development, in particular, it is rarely one risk lurking around the corner, but many. Some are preventable, some may not be. And if the system can make assumptions explicit, preserve contradictions instead of averaging them away, and highlight where evidence is fragile and uncertainty is high, it can help us, the teams, and also our key stakeholders to make better decisions in service of patients getting the medicines they need faster. Now, from also the statistics and data science lens, the key, at least from my perspective, is governance. And just yesterday, in preparation of this panel, I read a LinkedIn post by Peter Arlett from the European Medicines Agency, where he emphasized the success with AI really depends on investment in data governance and quality. And this includes clear roles and responsibility for how we own data, but also the data stewards, the cataloging of our data assets, the metadata that needs to be up to date, the quality assurance, and so on and so on. So as Peter said in this post, this is a heavy lifting, but it is what makes data at the end findable, usable, and ultimately actionable for better decisions. So I want to somehow sum up my statement and say, if we translate Mihaela's and the team's idea into reality, this could become a way to increase our understanding without compromising protocol discipline, because it's a reasoning layer that is interpretable, auditable, and designed to stress test fragility continuously. With that, I hand over to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Justine. We'll now hear from Eoin.
Thanks very much, Marika. Eoin McKinney. I'm Chair of Medicine in Department of Medicine in Cambridge. I'm a faculty member of CCA, and my work in computational biology, but also in machine learning. I have been involved in clinical trials and their design in drug discovery, target identification, all the way through to treating patients. So I've got perspectives on all points of that journey. For me, the massively interesting thing here is that when I've done trials work before, I'll come across clinical trialists who are considered experienced if they've done 10 clinical trials, and actually many have not done that. There are pushing 600,000 clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov now. And the idea that we could build a system that has memory to retain and learn something that can be applied across those studies, because 10 clinical trials is not really enough experience to influence and improve our ability to design trials. I think 600,000 might be. So the idea that we could build a system that could learn and retain memory of that process is very attractive and perhaps feasible. I think there are several areas that we're going to discuss in this meeting, which is very exciting. So several areas where this needs to be stress tested. And for me, the big three are data access, the concept of whether there is, in fact, learnable information from one trial that can be generalized to the next. So 600,000 trials are not all of the same drug in the same disease. So to what extent is that learning transferable across those different contexts? And the third big one is validation and benchmarking, because unless we can do that and show that this works, people won't use it and won't believe in it. So for me, those are the three big areas, but I think it's a very exciting topic and an area that this could have huge impact. So thanks for convening it, Mihaela, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Eoin. Next, could we please have Anders?
Hi, I'm Anders Boyd. I'm a statistician. I guess I'm one of those trialists. I guess that Ian was described as experienced, let's just say. I've done a lot more clinical trials on phase 2 and phase 3. And I also do a lot of work with observational studies, looking at data that's been mostly collected in electronic health records. And so for me, what's really interesting about this, let's call framework, is that I think as a trialist, even as a statistician, you come across these very difficult questions. And I think, I'm sitting on 2 different data safety monitoring boards, and we have this issue of low recruitment. How do we deal with low recruitment? What are the types of decisions that we can use to help boost that recruitment, or should we stop the trial altogether? When do we go to a phase 2 to a phase 3? These are also very complicated questions, especially given the changing landscape and treatment. Also, during the phase 3 trial, you have these very specific moments where you try to determine whether or not you should continue that trial, not only statistical based, but based on other reasons. So I think how these reasoning agents would work to answer those types of questions would be really important. And because I work with a lot of observational data goes hand in hand really with phase 4 trials. So it'd be kind of interesting to see, what does these information that we've gathered from across the board, what are the types of questions that remain that could be addressed with these phase 4 observational studies? And I think a lot of these types of frameworks give, I guess, a lot of not only, helps address questions, but they also propose different types of research questions that might be useful in the future. That's all I kind of want to say about it.
Great, thank you, Anders. We'll now move on to Dr. Tracy Glassians, if you'd like to say a few words.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. My background is I'm a statistician. I started out in clinical trials and moved into observational data for quite a long time. And I've come back into the clinical trial setting in the last 10 years. But a lot of what I work on is very pragmatic. So in academia, implementation, resource limited settings. I am also part of many data safety monitoring boards, so I still have an eye into the pharmaceutical trials. And for me, this hits so many aspects that really could use some new air, some new development from many angles. I think I don't know how much the pharma is working inside, but definitely in an academic and a pragmatic trial setting, we are lacking the time and the resources to actually use the information we get just in our one trial alone and use it in good time. So I definitively agree about the idea of harnessing all of these 600,000 trials that have happened before to actually de-risking before the trial begins, but also that during the trial. And I just think the way things are set up now, the funding structures, the mechanisms, there's absolutely not enough time to do any of the kind of things you need to do to bring not only that quality in, but that innovation. And so I think that's one of the biggest barriers I see. And if we do bring it in, can the governance and can it react fast enough? So we certainly know very early on in our trial when we have trouble with compliance or recruitment, like Anders said, but what do you do about it? I think really the sites then become the bottleneck for, getting the data in shape to evaluate it in the first place, but reacting to what we see. And how can that be actually improved with this nice information? But I see that as one of the potential bottlenecks. And I think I'm interested to know, and I'm a little bit new I just read this paper at the end of last week, so I didn't have a lot of time to really think about it because I'm very interested in how somehow the statistical part stays the same with this information, that somehow you maintain that rigor while you're trying to use the data itself to help improve your efficiency. So I'm very open, very interested to see where it goes. So thank you for having me be part of this.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Now we'll move on to Professor Parashkev.
Hi everyone, I'm Parashkev Nachev. I'm a neurologist and a computational neuroscientist. I suppose my perspective is that we really need to confront the fundamental conceptual problem that I think for too long everyone's ignored, which is that we're dealing with extraordinarily complex systems. It's particularly obvious in the context of the brain, which after all is the most complex system we know, or rather we don't know. I say that neurology now is meteorology done by horologists. And I think it's unfortunately close to the truth. And so what we need to acknowledge is the fundamental complexity of that system and therefore the need for having models of it that are of commensurate expressivity. And what I really like about this proposal is that it acknowledges that the complexity is distributed across the entire stack of research and development. And indeed, everything that's superimposed on the complexity of patients themselves has to be complex in itself. And I think the challenge here is clearly a very substantial technological challenge, how we actually build these things. But there is also a huge intellectual and in many respects emotional task to persuade the community that they really need to think about biology in a very different way. It's a very uncomfortable thing because many of us dream of having the biological equivalent of E equals MC squared, and it ain't gonna happen. And that's not a comfortable thing to have to admit to oneself and to persuade others of.
Very insightful. Now, finally, we'll have Richard.
Thanks, Marika. So I'm Richard Peck. I'm a clinical pharmacologist, and I spent over 30 years in the drug industry trying to develop drugs. So like Justine, I think of myself as a drug developer rather than a specific technical expert. I think there are probably two areas here, one of which has certainly been mentioned, and maybe the other one hasn't. The first area that interests me is we try to do each of the component pieces that Mihaela outlined already. We're not ignoring these issues, but they're largely done in isolation of one another, and that's particularly true when you need to start making changes in your development plan or in your trial plan, where the focus becomes on the particular area that might be the concern. Let's pick up on the example that's been mentioned before of slow recruitment. And you start asking, well, what can we do? And the answers tend to come back as, well, if you want to increase recruitment, this is what you can do. And there's very little attention and certainly no quantitative attention paid to what's going to be the impact on the potential efficacy of the drug, what's going to be the impact on the regulatory side, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, the number one interest here is handling all these things, recognizing that these things are all interrelated and handling that all together. So that's the first piece. The second piece, which, Mihaela, I'm going to say it may not be entirely what you're thinking of in this trial, but anything that allows us to better recognize the reality that treatment effects are heterogeneous and then know what we might be able to do about it is something I'm going to support. Because the idea that everybody who you might want to treat is going to respond exactly the same way as the average patient in the population that you studied before is just wrong. And yet that's what doctors have to do. So I'm hoping that through the mechanisms that are put in place, perhaps to solve one problem, we might make some progress towards solving another.
Yeah, very well said, Richard. I'm now going to pass it back to Mihaela to commence the panel discussions.
Thank you very much for all your insightful comments and for all the feedback you already gave to me and the new one that I'm going to get. So let us start. So multiple of you mentioned data and the importance of data if there is to be done, anything to be done. So a question I have is, do we currently have enough clinical data and real-world data and other types of data potentially to support this continuously learning system? Or would meaningful deployment require different types of data sets or different scale of data or securing cross-sponsor data sharing infrastructures or building consortium level platforms? I'd like to pose this question to you first, Eoin, and then since Justine is very much involved in a number of consortium level platforms, to Justine.
Thanks, Michaela. I guess if you ask a data scientist if they have enough data, the answer is always going to be no, because they always want more. There's a huge amount of data there already, right? So um, there may be enough, and I think it depends which level of your framework we're talking about, whether it's the biological agent, whether it's the statistical, the operational, the regulatory, and it differs by each of those levels. Some of those levels are really sparse, they're just not shared, they're the nuts and bolts of a trial that don't really see daylight, so would be hard to systematically accumulate. For some of them, like biological data, yes, maybe we do have, but even for the last 10 years or more, since individual patient data is supposed to be being reported with trials, when we systematically look at the rates that that data is actually accessible, it's very low. Um, there are platforms that help share trial data, accessible platforms that you can sign up to, that industry can sign up to, Vivly, Transcelerate, many others. They typically give access to individual studies rather than to all studies. So the amount of data that would be available on all of these 600,000 studies, let's say, as a learning set, is going to be very sparse. You're going to get a minimal data set on each one. So I think the answer probably is no, there isn't enough data, at least not for every tier. And that alternative approaches for more widespread sharing would definitely be helpful. That said, it partly depends on what you're going to use this for, because being able to do even any one of those tiers that you're describing in isolation, let alone being able to knit them all together, would be a massive leap forward. So there may be enough data to do parts of this. And also whether it was being done internally or externally. Let's say a company wanted to develop this where they have their own in-house data for, again, every clinical trial that they have ever done. Well, actually, that could be hugely valuable, and this framework may sit very nicely upon that without needing necessarily to access every trial that's ever been done. Um, I won't go into the interrelation between trials because I know that's coming, but that's obviously dependent. You could pick out niche examples where you might have enough data in oncology, but not in inflammatory disease, for example. And there may be places where this could start. I'll pause there.
Maybe just to briefly interject there. So, what about this idea that I'm trying to construct there of decision theoretic digital twins, where maybe the focus is not perfect accuracy of the representative twin, but rather good enough to be able to make better decisions on the basis of it?
Yeah, I think that's very important. It's very important to stress what success looks like. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be more or better information that helps you to make a better decision at each stage. That's hard to quantify, as we'll inevitably come to in terms of validating and benchmarking. But yes, I think there probably is enough data to help us do better and learn from what has been done before in a better way, even if it's not perfect. And I think it never will be perfect, and nor should we wait for it to be perfect. We'll be waiting a long time.
Christine.
Yeah, so I'm listening, with curiosity, and I have to say I always debate a little bit with myself when hearing this question, because this is not the first time that I'm asked this question, and I would say yes and no. We have, depending on the question, sometimes enough data, and we also overestimate very often the amount of good quality data we have. Internally and also externally. So perhaps there is no clear answer to this, but what I would like to elaborate on is a little bit the question, of what kind of data do we truly need? How much of this data do we need to answer a specific question? And it always depends really on the questions we have, right? So as the insights are only as good as the questions that we ask. And then, when I look internally, and internally can mean within industry, within one company, but also within, institute working in academia. Where is this data? Can we find it? Is this data in one platform? And even if it's there, are we able to process this data? Does this data speak to each other? Is the connection given? Are people who work on this data, able to get insights from this data, and so on and so on. So this is the internal part. And then there is, of course, the external part. If we look across, I would say, consortia, across industry collaborations, industry academia collaborations, and I think my colleague just mentioned Transcelerate. This is just one example, but there is more. The question is, how do we leverage the data that we all have in a collaborative way? And also, how do we ensure that we have the proper use of this data? And I mean, you described in your paper different approaches, how to use this data, for biological agents, how to use this data for all statistical parts, regulatory, competitive parts. So I think the key issue will be to connect all of this to ensure coherent reasoning across these heterogeneous streams. And what we, I think, need to do is, and I think your paper sets a high bar, is, what kind of data will we use also in retrospect? Not just the prospective ones, but also the retrospective benchmarking will be important, because here we know this is also a quality issue that we need to consider. This is perhaps a starting point to your question, Michaela.
Thank you, Justine. Just very briefly, as maybe I'm an optimist here, but I'd say very recently I'm much more optimistic about AI, and especially these AI agents being capable to harmonize data sets, to deal with errors in the data, with imperfections in the data. So I think there is a little bit more hope than ever before that a lot of the data wrangling and also the data connectivity can be done somewhat easier than has ever been possible before with some of these agentic frameworks. So hopefully some of the nasty, dirty work for which huge amount of people were needed before can now be done somewhat by this low level, not that smart, but sufficiently intelligent agents. But that's subject for a separate debate, so I won't. Thank you so much for that. Maybe I move to another question now. More, assuming that such data is available, what are the minimum practical requirements in terms of data coverage, governance, organizational workflows, integration, for moving this framework from an aspirational concept to a more deployable decisions support across the entire developmental pipeline? And maybe what I do is I start with you, Anders, and then I move to Tracy, and then if Justine and Eoin or anyone else want to comment. So I'm sending it to you, Anders.
Well, I think to me, I think there's certain, I guess, certain issues that need to be, not issues, but I guess certain information that needs to be available, especially for these some higher tiered, higher level concepts. And the example I always think of is like, especially with this competitive nature. I mean, you really need inter-industry collaboration to make that work almost. And the example I think of is especially when direct antiviral agents came out with hepatitis C. I mean, that was a massively quick, evolving, dynamic movement in the therapy for hepatitis C. And I forgot which pharmaceutical company, they came up with a regimen that had a 70% success rate in terms of getting rid of hepatitis C. But during this trial, Savasir came out from Gilead that had 100%, practically 100% cure rate. When you're doing this trial, how do you know that there's another a drug on the market that's going to outperform your drug while you're doing your phase 3 trial? And I think there's these types of competitive things where you'll probably need some sort of industry collaboration, but how will you get that taken care of? And that's just one example of, I guess, many you could think of what are the bits of information you need to get these higher level, I guess, infrastructures working in your framework.
Yeah, I would agree with Anders. I keep thinking about how the pharmaceuticals are sharing across companies. But even within their own company, I wonder how efficient they are in using their history, trials, and information. I'm imagining it's not as ideal as it should be. And certainly, even in my own setting, I have my own history of trials, and the amount of data that is collected is just overwhelming and often not utilized. It's very inefficient how we run our trials, very inefficient. And I so often think, oh, it'd be so great to go back to those trials and really look into those different scenarios that could have happened or what could have been done. So I see a lot of potential in the past studies also to be used given new tools and new perspectives. And I think we can also talk about how sometimes we've seen some good harnessing and data sharing, like in the HIV observational cohort framework, across countries, across settings. There's just been collaborations formed and shared, and a lot of progress was made, even though observational data made a lot of progress in, I think, the field as a whole. And I think it remains a good model for other disease areas as well.
Maybe jumping on that point, Tracy, that you just made, let's talk a little bit about learning across the different studies. So, to some extent, a core assumption of at least part of what I try to put forward is that developmental knowledge can accumulate indeed across these different trials. So, a question to you, all of you, is to what extent can trial design principles truly transfer across diseases, therapeutic modalities, populations, and how should we quantify when historical experience is informative versus we should refrain from using it because it can be misleading? I don't know exactly to whom to phrase this, but if any of you wants to jump in, please do.
I just jump in quickly, Mihaela, because I think the fact that umbrella trials, basket trials, the fact that they exist is pretty clear evidence that yes, information can transfer between individual studies. Probably more so than we appreciate. There have been systematic analyses of trial characteristics, taking the sort of information you might get on trials.gov and seeing whether you can identify clusters of trials. And indeed, there does seem to be some sort of hierarchical structure there. So maybe you can't extrapolate from every study onto every other study, but certainly you can learn from interrelated groups. And that's the sort of interrelating network of studies that a twin or agent-based system would have to learn. So I think it definitely can be done, the extent to which it can be done, the extent to which endpoints are shared, case definitions are shared, the extent to which recruitment rates are conserved across different disease populations, even in the same center. Many of those things are unknown, but those are questions that I don't think are systematically asked across lots of different studies. So even asking the questions, I think takes us further forward.
And then to build on what Eoin was saying, I mean, clearly another area where there's opportunity to capture across studies is within a disease area. You know, again, there's going to be the challenge of how can you access all of the data or some or all of the data given, and that will be particularly a challenge when those trials might reside in different pharmaceutical companies who are obviously innately competitive with one another. But within therapeutic areas, there's probably quite a lot that can be learned, I suspect. One of the advantages of the position I had, pharma companies are very therapeutically organized these days, which means that people in one disease area know almost nothing about what's been learned in another disease area, apart maybe from the sort of headline that goes out across the whole company saying drug X worked. And one of the few things that I could contribute in my last few years in Roche was I did tend to see across all the therapeutic areas. And, you know, there were times when I was pointing one therapeutic area people at, they've just had exactly that problem. And this would be more a study design issue or a safety signal issue or something of those sorts. They've just pretty much had exactly that problem in this project in a totally different disease area. So you might want to go and talk to them. So that makes me think that there will be, and there are some things that, both study design issues, but also some of the emerging considerations within a trial. And I don't just mean slow recruitment and so on, but some of the scientific things that arise, like there's a safety problem that's come up. Actually, it surprised me how often some of the same learnings can be used in terms of what actions you take to manage the trial, not necessarily mitigate the safety issue itself, because that will be different from one molecule to another, but how you might ensure your trial stays valid. There's often quite some commonality there.
Perhaps I can build on
Surely the
this.
opposite. Sorry, I was just going to say, surely the opposite will be profoundly surprising. After all, it's always a human being that we're modeling. And it seems astonishing that we should be approaching a trial as if it's in a vacuum. We have to begin with priors. Of course, they have to be the right priors, and there's dangers in having the wrong priors. But it would be bizarre not to seek commonalities and not to exploit them to the maximum. And those will operate both across diseases, across populations, and across the context in which a trial is conducted. That I think is just inevitable by the nature of the system that we're studying.
And perhaps I can build on what also Richard said. I worked in oncology for more than 12 years and then switched to obesity and cardiovascular, space. And I have to say, it's not just the statistical principles, it's also the thinking and the understanding of the diseases that you can even transfer and also apply, right? But now, again, with the statistical lens, we have some guiding principles. This is the backbone. So this is something that is for sure transferable and real. Nonetheless, when I think of the data again, and coming back to Michaela's question, I would ask another question. When is history informative enough to guide us to the future and answer or, questions or anticipate future scenarios? And when is it misleading? It might sound again a bit provocative and perhaps like showstopper, but this is something we need to ask because not all historic data is good data, and it's not the data that we must and should use also for the future predictions or anticipating different scenarios. And what transfers very well, I think I don't want to repeat everything the others said, but recurring classes of operational and statistical failure modes, I would say recruitment bottlenecks, we see them all over the places in different therapeutic areas, in industry and in academic trials. We see site heterogeneity, we see protocol burdens, deviations, missingness of data, loss to follow up. All these issues, they don't disappear. And I would say over the last 20 years, the issues are still there. The handling of them developed and evolved and is much better now. And nonetheless, they are there. So this is something I would definitely say we should capture also with our approach. Where does it not work that well? So where is this transfer quite poor? I would say from my experience, when we try to make predictions about efficacy, expectations across diseases, modalities, and also mechanistic anchoring. And when we also look into subgroups, when measurements regimens differ, when we don't know enough about our competitors in the future, especially because the standard of care changes. And I think with that, the approach proposed can give us better direction. Also, when it comes to evaluating the twins, for decision reliability, not just for prediction, as Michaela said, but also for calibration, for robustness, and also relative ranking of different strategies, how to develop drugs that really make it faster to the patients they need it. Yeah, so this would be something from, I think, my perspective we should think about.
Just briefly, and for the audience questions, we are going to move to audience question towards the later part of the talk. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Anders, just briefly, I know it was a popular question, but I have multiple others as well. So
just very briefly, I think one other thing that's different between the etiologies of diseases, and Tracy and I have worked in HIV for very many years. There's a lot of our decisions are based on patient guidance. And we have a very strong patient group that allows us to kind of figure out what are the types of therapies that they want. When I used to work in cancer, that was years ago. I remember that was a very big problem. Our patient groups, yeah, it wasn't as active as what we had in HIV. And even viral hepatitis, it's not as active as HIV. So I think when we think about some of these decisions that go, I mean, these are also inputs that differ between the etiologies, and that might also have an influence in how this framework works. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot. Again, please, everyone, if you have questions from the audience, put them in the chat. We'll get back to them soon. Let's now turn to implementation barriers. What do you see as the single most challenging barrier to the framework which I have introduced that is going to continuously update the risking within this active developmental process? Methodological validation, data integration, government constraints, organizational incentives, or something else? Tracy, I'm starting with you and then anyone else.
So I love this idea, right? But I'm trying to figure out how it really works, right? So it's clear if I find signals and information within a framework that is set out, I can make changes. And I should. This is this adaptive trials, right? You kind of set up in advance a framework for the possibility that things come out other than new information, and you make adaptations. Things that you don't plan for, just information that's coming and being brought in. I don't yet see how you can action on that. So first of all, when should you action on it? When is it a false signal? Just an early signs of something that actually won't hold out over time. So when is it the right moment to act if you aren't following the statistical principles that you set out? And how do you action on something more efficiently than you're already trying to do? So what do you do if you find out that there's a new standard, or the standard of care is changing? Besides adding an arm, dropping an arm. So the same thing, tools we already have. So I'm trying a little bit to try to understand how this information suggestion can, during the trial, de-risk in a way that we're not always already doing without compromising those statistical principles that are already trying to be flexible enough to move a bit around as time goes. Your statistical analysis plan is a living document, right? So it's trying to acknowledge that things are happening during the study that you need to interact on. So I think that's really, for me, a real challenge, is to get the whole system to use the data in real time to be making a difference beyond what we're already doing.
So Tracy, just very brief with a response from me. So the idea is both to put whatever already you are doing on steroids and allow for this interaction between the agents, to speed up the interactions and the risk in the discussion with different types of partners. Also to allow for a lot more data crunching and data processing and squeezing of signal than potentially you have. And again, learning from different trials. Anders, I'm passing to you both to respond to Tracy, because you and I have had some conversations about this, but also to provide your own perspective on what can we do to make this more real.
Yeah, I think
And
Tracy.
comparisons with adaptive trials, since you have asked me this question yourself.
Well, yeah, but I think that's the problem with as you do your trialist course, they say every time you peek at your data, you sacrifice your type 1 error, and so it always makes you scared. And so when you have this kind of real-time adjustment, when you constantly have to be peeking at the data in a certain way. But I mean, that's in a frequentist, of course, setting. But how do you make sure those statistical principles are aligned? Well, I don't want to do too adaptive, because then their type 1 error is going to be sacrificed by that. I think, but those are kind of statistical issues that I think can be settled, but we're not quite there yet. I think for me, the biggest thing really is more on the regulatory side. I think if we need to be very, very clear what we're doing and how, where the decision's coming from. And we need to make sure those decisions come from, actual, not empirical, but in a very well-informed choice, rather than someone behind the computer kind of driving the decisions where they may or may not need to be. I think that's kind of another issue on its own. So Yeah, and another thing too, especially with like the little tiny details, really this blinding. I think you said the blinding remains, but then when you make the decision, the AI has to, I keep on saying the AI, I don't know why, but the AI has to know who the treatments are, but we are still blind to the treatment. So is that okay? I mean, there's a little bit of these like kind of little tiny tweaks that kind of in terms of statistical sense need to be kind of ironed out before this really gets developed.
I assume that no information will be given to the agents that will not be given to a trialist, but of course I'm realizing that this needs to be done very carefully. I see a few hands raised. Please, I invite everyone who is not in the panel to put them in the questions list and people to vote and upvote questions, and we will get back to them shortly. Let's move now to a little bit maybe more controversial an issue, the issue of human oversights and autonomy. What is your perspective? Should multi-agent development decision systems function strictly as human-in-the-loop decision support, like I put forward? Or do you believe that in the longer term there is a credible pathway towards partially autonomous reasoning layers? And what type of governance would we require in that case? And I'd like to put this question especially to the clinicians in the room, to Eoin and Parashkev, but then anyone else.
Thanks, Mila. Sorry, Parashkev, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I think the principles here are very straightforward. The clinician is always in charge, obviously together with the patient, and that any clinical decision is always going to be assigned to a human being. Now, when we make decisions in clinical practice, we rely not just on evidence, but we rely on intelligence. That's what any trial is. When we speak of evidence-based, we are talking about intelligence, we're not talking about knowledge. We say, oh, we are within the inclusion criteria of the specific trial result. It says that on average, people who take this drug do get better. Therefore, that is what I would recommend. So in essence, we have already conceded that although it is always a clinician who prescribes, the intelligence that guides that prescription comes from a model. And what we are changing here is the nature of that model. The model is much more expressive. It may be more opaque, of course, and that's one issue that we have to handle and think carefully about. But it strikes me that there is a great deal of exceptionalism about AI in this context that perhaps isn't merited, because much of the transfer of intelligence, note intelligence, not knowledge, has already happened in the context of evidence-based medicine.
Just briefly from my perspective, Mila, human in the loop is fundamentally essential until you've validated, and often more than once. One of the major challenges with the framework is what exactly is it that we're validating? This is a multi-question, multi-system framework that has autonomy to some degree. It has agency by definition. Therefore, before you could give that any form of autonomy, you have to have human oversight until you're sure that it's making sensible, coherent calls that are helpful. Plus, if we're designing it as a decision support, of course, there has to be a human in the loop because that's who's being supported. So I think the way towards acceptance for this is to certainly begin with human in the loop. And I can't see a way in which you can short circuit that and go straight for full autonomy straight away. How you validate in that complicated system is a thorny question, and I know it's one you're coming to, so I won't get the jump on it. I'll leave it there.
Let's jump to some of that. So let's talk about the regulatory credibility and as well as the benchmarking that comes with this type of framework. So what kind of benchmarking framework or validation strategy or regulatory science collaborations would be necessary for the systems like the one I put forward to be considered credible inputs into real developmental decision making? Maybe Justine, I start with you, and then Richard, and then Tracy, and everyone else can jump in.
Thank you, Michaela. And I mean, this is a really tough question, I have to say, and I don't have all the answers. So this is, I think, a collective effort also for the future. Let me start perhaps with what you just said, all of you. I still think this is really a decision support. And because it's a decision support, it will help us to debias some of our thinking, make assumptions explicit, highlight uncertainty and fragility. And now coming back to your regulatory credibility and benchmarking, I think this will come from context of use qualification, transparency, and also the way how we can trace it back and how we can change, or I would say thinking based on how we prove assumptions along the way. And as I said, I don't have all the answers, but a practical approach could be to start, with some minimum requirements that need to be there, right? And then perhaps flex them a little bit along the way and see how they develop when we use benchmarking from the different pieces. And benchmarking can come again from industry because they are these cross-industry collaborations. We mentioned Transcelerate, but I would like to mention also Disrupt, for example, Disrupt Data Science Roundtable. So a big, I would say, collaborative effort of 14 companies where we have a lot of benchmarking regarding challenges, regarding the future direction, but also regarding the use cases, where we are right now and where we should be also in the future. So perhaps this kind of exchange can help us to also talk to regulators and develop this further together. Because this would be for me the ideal scenario, that we don't do it, just for example in industry, but we do it in the triad between regulatory or health authorities, academia and industry.
Shall I jump in, Mihaela? I think what Justine has just said is absolutely critical and is spot on. The key thing here is, so you spend 30 years in industry, there's a risk that you see the regulator as a barrier, and they're not actually. Occasionally they can be, but most of the time regulators are actually trying to do essentially the same thing as everyone else. They want to get new treatments out onto the market and to have things available for patients to take. Regulators see themselves, from the ones who talk to me anyway, as trying to improve, quotes, public health, by which they mean we want to get the treatments out there. The difference from often the people on the sponsor side is, of course, what the regulator is most concerned about is letting something come out that shouldn't have done. Okay? Whereas the sponsored people tend to be their biggest concern in any new system you put in place is, might this end up stopping my project when it shouldn't have done? So they have different concerns about how something might get used and what may be the bigger false result, if you like. But fundamentally, everyone's trying to do the same thing. And where new technology is concerned, whatever we do to take this forward, if we're talking about clinical trials, particularly if we're talking about clinical trials that might lead to approval of some new treatment, it's absolutely critical to involve the key regulatory stakeholders at the earliest possible stage, because then they can be incredibly helpful, because they'll answer the questions, what might be someone worried about? We'll find out. And if it looks like a technology is beginning to go somewhere, regulators can start putting out documentation that says, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're seeing as good, this is what we're concerned about, this is what you might need to pay attention to, and that can be phenomenally useful to the people actually trying to develop the new technology.
Building on that, a question for all of you. What about this demonstrating the value? Because adoption of this type of ideas, like the ones I presented, will, of course, depend on demonstrating that they do improve actual decision making. What would constitute convincing evidence? Retrospective replay studies, which some of you mentioned, prospective shadow deployments, head-to-head comparisons against traditional trial design versus this AI-enabled trial design processes. What would be the right way to think about this? Any of you?
I think you have to start with retrospective, although it's challenging, particularly if you have an aware model that may have learned of what's already in the public domain. You move ideally from retrospective analysis, giving you confidence that this is at least feasible. And in other words, it could have generated information that would have been helpful in making a decision that wasn't available at the time. Always the risk that there's information leaked backwards, but if that's supportive enough, you then move forwards onto prospective design where you run this perhaps in parallel. You're talking about huge impact of costs. So following a model rather than a team that's been carefully assembled to address these questions is a big call. So I would see that probably as being a bolt-on to a study done in a conventional way, providing information that may not be followed, but at least prospectively you have it. And then after the trial is complete, you can look back and assess the value of that information. And if that's positive, it gets you to the stage where you are putting enough confidence in the framework that you would use it prospectively or test it in parallel prospectively, where you're actually acting on that information.
And if I may follow up on this, because I had more or less the same order, I have to say. So start, with retrospective replaying and benchmarking on historical trials, right? And prospective, also shadow deployments in active programs. But then moving forward, perhaps targeted head-to-head comparisons for specific decision points or inflection points. And I think if we could show then the impact really on decision making, in terms not just of timelines, but also providing and generating value to different stakeholders, not just payers or regulators, but also actually to patients, then I think we could show that it matters what we do. And perhaps one detail, I think we need really convincing metrics. And I'm not talking about KPIs, I'm really talking about leading indicators. How do we know that we move the needle into the right direction? How do we show that we really early detect the fragile assumptions that we have in this uncertain reality? How do we show that some of these late stage failures are preventable and we can reduce or even avoid them, and so on? So we need some, I think, good leading indicators, and this is also something I would love to work on with all of you.
I think we should acknowledge that these are fundamentally counterfactual problems. And so actually showing proof that you made the successful decision is always going to be extraordinarily difficult. And we need to do a whole load more simulation than we currently do, because that's really the only way to get a handle on it. And the other problem is that the feedback here is very sparse. Let's imagine we're optimizing end-to-end on an entire R&D program, which takes 10 years. So we get feedback from a single program every 10 years. Now, that's not something that we can overcome, but we have to acknowledge it. That will be a problem.
Thank you all very much for this final question for me, and then finally we can go to the many questions that I think the audience has. To put together such a framework and to build such a framework, I put in my white paper just a few ideas to provoke thinking and a discussion, but clearly people from very diverse domains need to be involved in building such a framework. I'd like to hear the thoughts of any of you on how to build such a collaborative, let's say, interdisciplinary group that can indeed construct something that is useful to the risk trials using digital twins and AI. Any thoughts on building such teams and how to move the process forward?
Michaela, perhaps I can start because I still remember, FDA workshop, or I think it was last year or the year before, where I heard the term of multi-fluent teams. So not just people, who come with a subject matter expertise and work cross-functionally together, but really people who are multi-fluent in a way where you see the whole team is going into the same direction. They really understand what needs to be done and provide the expertise in a more, I would say, less siloed way. Yeah. And I see somehow the parallel, when we talk about multi-agents to these multi-fluent teams, we need people who know what matters, but provide this in a way that is understandable for the others as well. Just as a starting point.
Richard?
So I'm wondering about something that you and I discussed a little bit in a different context, which is pick a disease area. Try to find, is there somewhere where there is the right combination of enthusiastic and interested people, because they're going to be essential to drive anything, where there's data that's accessible, where there are trials, there's a past history of trials, and there's a future expectation of more trials. So there has to be an obvious clinical need. Perhaps there are, new therapies, a clear need for new therapies. Maybe that's all diseases, I don't know. But where there's also perhaps what we might think of as a big enough either patient demand or public health need. Again, Anders and Tracy mentioned HIV. I mean, I don't know whether that's right for the other reasons, but it's a brilliant example of how patients who really need something will make it happen because they have a much more vested interest in making it happen than maybe the rest of us do. So I'm not sure what that disease area could be. I mean, there are some obvious examples in the sense of rare diseases because that drives the patient demand, and perhaps some cancers and so on, because there's already quite a lot of knowledge in certain areas. I did also wonder, though, about a very common disease like diabetes, type 2 diabetes, or even obesity, because there will be a lot of information. And when you look at something like obesity, there's going to be an enormous public health need, because if we're going to end up with a high percentage of the population all trying to get on a GLP-1, it's going to get extremely expensive for whoever's paying for the healthcare. And perhaps they might be interested to better understand how we could do more trials to improve the ability to select the right people and so on and so forth. But trying to do everything all at once is not going to work. Trying to solve operational problems in one area and biological issue, the biological agent in a different area, it's just inefficient. And if you can get one area and really start to make some progress, other people will start to say, hey, why can't we do that?
I agree. I think you have to take the heterogeneity out of some aspects and really go somewhere in one area where you're limiting it, a lot of data, like you said. I also think I'm thinking a little bit about this. I worry it's something we didn't really bring up is credibility, right? I'm a little bit worried about this concept of this AI kind of spitting out things. And I have been involved in studies or trials where unexpected things happen. And very quickly, people go to the justification about why that could be possible, because there's a lot at stake. So they don't want to say, absolutely, this makes no sense. This can't be, something's wrong. Oh yeah, I can see how I could see how that could work. So I think you also need an area where people are really have a lot of biological basis to use the AI information credibly. I think that's also something I would start with before you go into very new areas, maybe.
Tracy, what I would say is more than that is to have that knowledge, not because they don't trust these agents, but to train these agents to learn to be mistrusting of themselves, of the other agents, and even push the human to think again. Thank you very much, all. I see some questions, so I'm going to give over to Tim. I want to point out that Susan has had her hand for a long time. So I think we should start with Susan's question, and then I saw that Radek had a question as well. So Tim, I give over to you, but thank you all very much for answering my questions and discussing with me this white paper. Tim.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really great discussion already. And yes, Susan Galbraith, if you would like to start with your question, and then we can go through the Q&A chat.
Okay, cool. So just let me introduce myself first. I head oncology research and development at AstraZeneca. So again, thank you very much for the discussion and for the paper. I think a very exciting innovation in this space. Just a couple of comments. You asked a question about what's the kind of minimum bar for which this would show utility. And from my perspective, I think in a nearer term piece than waiting for a full phase 3 to read out and then going back, I think if you could look at early phase data and with digital twins help simulate and expand the confidence in that, particularly to address the heterogeneity question, you move into later phase, you might see output from that in a nearer term time frame that would have utility. And I think that is likely doable. The second comment I would make is in terms of a space where there might be a drive for intercompany collaboration. One example is we have, for example, worked with Friends of Cancer Research with a number of companies come together and shared phase 3 data in the area of circulating tumor DNA, trying to use that as an endpoint for clinical trials. So there are some examples where there are honest brokers, if you like, that can bridge between different companies and get patient-specific data with outcomes shared in that kind of context. So it has been done, it's possible to do, but I think it would require that kind of honest broker collaboration in order to facilitate it. And the area of lung cancer is one where there's plenty of trials, plenty of unmet need, plenty of desire to make a difference. So those are just some thoughts. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks.
Would anyone like to comment, or shall we already move on to the next?
I think the extrapolation from one phase to the next is a great example of where this could be valid. I guess that focuses in on the idea of twins and synthetic data sort of in the biological strata rather than even needing to stitch the whole thing together in a multi-agent framework. I think that's a great point, is that this needn't work as an all-encompassing system to have huge value. In fact, one of these pieces works, then that could have real utility.
But perhaps just to add, one issue here is that you will not have any experience of that specific intervention. So what the digital twin would really have to learn is the background context, because that's the only thing it's exposed to. But that is commonly neglected in trials, or certainly not modeled adequately. And so that we could definitely supply. This is less about heterogeneous treatment responses than the background against which any response can be detected.
Although I guess to pick that up, if you have done 10 trials where you've moved from phase 2 to phase 3 and we're currently seeing the same problem with a population shift that trips you up, the question really is how extrapolatable do you think that shift is to the next trial that you undertake? Is there something that you can... I completely agree with you, Parashkev, that the intervention itself may be different, but if you're repeatedly doing these trials, there may be something that can be brought to bear that helps you feel better next time, even if it's not perfect.
What the hope is with the AI, sorry. No, sorry, Parashkev. So, and what the hope is with the AI is exactly that you would learn what is the relevant information that you can learn on the basis of what's the value of a certain information and what's doable and from what and what's not. And I think even trying this and trying to understand what's useful information would be by itself useful. Sorry, Parashkev.
No, so I think we made the point.
Okay, brilliant. We had one more question that sort of went into a similar direction by Radek Bukovsky, if you would like to also ask that live. Perfect.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I was kind of wondering always, and I think we spoke about it before in those meetings, is that if we should not, when we evaluate this, reverse the question. I mean, the ultimate target of all the trials is the decision making between patient and physician. And I am looking always at this, from a clinician point of view. So what is really important is, I think, if we are talking about metrics, and I think that Michaela brought it up several times, asking what it would be. From my point of view, the way I see it, it will be basically the value of the information. I think you mentioned something like usefulness of information. Looking at it from decision-making point of view, it would be something like expected value of the sample information, when you can determine, using those agents, for example, what is if the information, the test, the treatment is bringing us closer to the decision that is an optimal decision or better decision. And so basically one that improves the outcomes, and look at it in an automated way, perhaps. Always at the trials from this point of view, as not as what kind of new treatment or new test are we bringing and how can we do it. I understand that there are some different interest in this, but from the point of view of clinician, the interest is how much is going to help me to make a better decision, not is this another test that I can use or another treatment. So if those agents could do that, and we could do it automatically, I think this would be a real value. And of course, that will go together with, or actually be fueled by, other things, which are always problems with randomized trials or trials, clinical trials in general, which is generalizability, which I think we do. I guess we kind of talk about it here in a little bit in parallel, or maybe tangentially. But this is, I think, the critical one, heterogeneity of treatment effect, which is related to that as well. And this is the things that really impact the decision-making process, not internal validity of those trials, which also have a problem, because we have, the other thing that those agents, I think, could do is to look, for example, detect the randomization failures, which actually are not that uncommon. Being on the editorial boards, I can see it actually quite often, that what happens, especially with the so-called negative trials, very frequently is actually randomization failure. So talking about that, and I think somebody mentioned the other questions I had was, if we have a prospective, now moving to prospective way of evaluating the trials, if we're looking at this, is agent looking and monitoring a trial wouldn't be something, I think one of the panelists mentioned something related to that, wouldn't be this akin to, or wouldn't it be seen maybe as continuous interim analysis, which I think will be quite a problem statistically, I would assume. I'm not sure, actually, because I think we are moving into the area that is not very clear, at least not to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Radek, for that. That point was brought forward to me by Justine as well. And in a revision of the white paper, I tried my best to address it. So I'm curious what you will think about it. But I think that indeed the information that I envision is only the information that's available to trialists as well. So it is not really about using anything that would unblind results and so on. But of course, I'm aware that this needs to be very carefully considered. So,
well, thank you.
Maybe related to your question, since you made this point, maybe I can use this to put a question to all of you, which is related to competing definitions of success. So we talk about clinical success, we talk about other types of success for patients, for instance. What should multi-agent decision systems like the ones that I presented here, how should they represent and reconcile competing definitions of success when coordinating and when making recommendations to human stakeholders? Any thoughts on that?
My simple thought, Mihaly, is that I don't think they should. I think this is probably where they interact with the human in the loop, and the human in the loop defines success and uses this framework to support that decision. I think otherwise, pre-training or fine-tuning a framework towards a particular definition of success becomes too constrained to be broadly useful, and I suspect that you will have dynamic changing definitions of success. So I'm not sure it can be predefined in that way. Others may disagree.
Absolutely. I think the value system has to be ours, not the machine. The machine delivers it, but we have to set it. And typically the primary value is going to be delivering treatments that give everyone the best opportunity for health. The one agreed definition of what medicine is supposed to be doing. Of course, it has to be contextualized by the commercial context and all the rest of it, because otherwise nothing will ever happen, but that has to be primary. That's how it has to be.
Perhaps one comment from my side. I remember some of our pre-discussions when we met for the very first time, discussing this paper. And we said, what is not success? So it's not about optimizing everything, for, I would say, a positive trial, right? It's about what we at least said, when I recall it correctly, is about getting the right insights from the trials. It could be also that we don't have a successful drug, right, as early as possible, so that we can prioritize something else and develop medicines that make more sense and are, more needed for the patients in need. So this is not just about optimizing, the success of trials in terms of efficacy and safety. In this typical, I get a positive or, significant trial result at the end. So this is something perhaps we could also make clear. It's not the success we are talking about here.
Okay, thank you everyone for going in depth there. I want to bring up a question from, I think it's Simon Bruce, especially the one on the trial flight simulator. If we could focus on that one, that would be very interesting because it's pertinent to the current discussion.
Hi, yes, so I'm Sebastian, sorry, and I'm a med student and also an AI student in Amsterdam. So yeah, so there was a lot of talk about the data set, and it's going to be difficult to acquire it. So I was thinking maybe it could be an idea to make some kind of trial simulator in which we use, well, maybe even like real world real world data about patients and about trials, but then we let clinicians kind of make decisions in a simulator where they receive data and they can choose how to adjust the trials themselves. And then maybe the agent could learn from the different decisions that clinicians make. So I was wondering, maybe this could be an idea to create like a big data set for the agents, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
Definitely, from a machine learning perspective, this could be done. So one could instantiate just the generative framework, the simulation framework, the digital twins, and then let humans interact with these digital twins and learn from them. One through inverse reinforcement learning techniques and inverse decision modeling techniques. One could also potentially learn from existing decisions that have been made, good and bad, or in past trials, and use this information as well as the result of this information in the future to learn from that, to instantiate the original or the initial policies of these agents. I think all these are good ideas that could be tried and evaluated in the framework, at least from a machine learning perspective, but I don't know whether anyone else wants to comment from another perspective.
I have perhaps one comment from the behavioral perspective, or from the, I would say, again, a psychological perspective. What we should be aware of is that, there is this hindsight bias, right? So if we evaluate something like this, we should also go back to the information and evaluate then how good our decision was. The decision is always made based on the available information at this time point. We cannot, say, oh, this was a good decision based on more information in the future. So this is something we should be aware of, that all the biases we have, the confirmation bias and also the hindsight bias, this should be integrated into our, I would say, multi-agent thinking as well, moving forward. Otherwise, we just do the same as we do today.
Perhaps, though, we should be clear that to build this model, we need data in the first place. So it unfortunately doesn't solve the problem of not having access to data, because we cannot specify the system procedurally, that we don't know enough about it. So once we have data, then of course it's how we might be able to advance into adjacent domains, and that's the whole point of a digital twin. But we can't easily escape the need for very large-scale, comprehensive, fully inclusive data if this is to be of sufficiently high fidelity.
But wouldn't this create the data set itself? Because you run like simulated trials, so clinicians can make their own decisions within this simulated arena. So you kind of like get data from the simulation, and then clinicians make decisions, which they would also make in like real world.
You
trials.
can, but it will only be faithful to the extent to which it is actually informed by reality, because there's relatively few principles the one a priori can put in. Of course, one can, but the reality is that we probably can't get far enough. So, no, of course, this is the right way to do it. As Mihaela says, this is exactly what we would do. The point is that it doesn't escape us from the need for data. We still need substantial data, I think, to build these things.
And I would still, I would still ask then the question, we will never have, as we mentioned before, we probably never had 100% of all the information needed. So how, nonetheless, we assess the decision-making part, and, how do we really help clinicians making the right decisions under uncertainty? That would be, for me, the main objective in the long term.
Sebastian, your question is a great one, and we spent quite some time in a recent roundtable meeting discussing exactly this point. And it was pointed out that when people were validating delivery drones, they can create a synthetic environment, and then the first time they used them in anger, they worked perfectly. So the idea of creating a synthetic hospital environment to test agents in makes perfect sense. The problem, of course, is how do you validate or benchmark your synthetic environment? Does it look like a hospital? Does it work like a hospital? Not all hospitals work the same. So what is it you're actually trying to build in that synthetic environment? So trying to build something that is real world representative is tough. And you simply kick your problem of trying to validate your agent down one step further. You're trying to benchmark your synthetic environment instead. But I suspect that's where this will end up. And we'll probably need a lot more people involved in computer software and development. And we actually were thinking about trying to employ some computer gamers in order to build software environments. So I think that coming back to the idea that different skill sets will be required, this underscores that completely.
Thank you. Before we sort of go to some final statements, we wanted to shift focus a bit. There was one question which I'm going to rephrase in the interest of time real quick. And the question is basically, could vulnerable minority groups benefit from an agentic framework like this, who can usually not be included in clinical trials because of some prerequisites like pregnancy or other issues that would prevent them from entering clinical trials. Do you think that an agentic framework and digital twins could be helpful there?
I don't think you need to propose agents for that. I think twins definitely. So this is more of a question, I think, around synthetic data. Can you use existing data to extrapolate into new populations? Of course, that has to be validated and benchmarked. Can we create real world evidence from real world data? And I think there's some great examples, including from Hill's lab, to suggest that is possible. Whether we can then use synthetic data to extrapolate into new populations, and in fact, the increasingly large bulk of the patient population who are excluded from clinical trials, and there's, I think, a huge potential benefit there and huge impact. So yes, I think that's a great application of twins rather than of an agentic framework per se.
Completely agree with Owen. And indeed, Tim, there is work that comes from our lab, which was one of the first to try to look at these rare populations and rare diseases and make some initial progress. I think a lot more needs to be done, but it shows that innovative use of synthetic data, I often say synthetic data better than real data, partially because it can create the biased data sets, but also it can enrich populations. So at least some progress in that area, but I think a lot more needs to happen.
Wonderful. So potential extension there as well. I think it's time to sort of not already close, but get closer to the end of the session. And for that, I would like to invite each of the panel to sort of close with a final statement on how you hope to make something similar to this framework real, what your intentions are in future developments of clinical trials. And I think for simplicity, we'll just do the same order as previously and start with Justine and then go through the entire panel. And thank you so much for everything you've said already. It was a really wonderful discussion.
I'm happy to go. Nonetheless, I wished I would be the last this time, but okay. So listening to this conversation, which was very inspiring, I have to say, I'm more convinced than before that this could be a way forward for a better informed decision support in the future. When and how we do it, this is, I think, something up to us. It's a collective effort, so we don't have all the answers, as we, I think, recognize today. So I hope that more people will join us to move forward, because we need to do it in a way that is still, I would say, scientific, where we keep the statistical rigor, where we have very clear understanding what the outcome is, where we involve also our regulatory colleagues. And I was also wondering today, after listening to my colleagues, how can we really involve patients more into these conversations and discussions moving forward? So I am very optimistic, and nonetheless, there are probably more questions now than answers after the end of the session. So motivated to work forward and together with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Eoin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, many thanks. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I think what is clear is that the framework would have huge value, but actually so would its component elements. We wouldn't need the entire framework to make a huge leap forward. If we can construct any aspect of this, that would take us part of the way there. And stitching everything together with a multi-agent network would be the cherry on top. So I think there's huge potential for progress. It sounds like there is enough data for us to start doing that, but we could do better at collecting it. And that seems to be a broad consensus that there is at least enough shared information between clinical studies for us to be able to learn more from the huge number that have been done. Perhaps the piece for me that needs a bit more thought is exactly how we would validate and benchmark this. those were my three areas: the data access, the cross-trial learning, and the validation and benchmarking. But I think it's a feasible framework, and I look forward to seeing it in progress. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And then Anders, you would be next.
Hi, I'm really quite excited about this, and I can't stop thinking about Richard's comment about what diseases go next. And I think, HIV, we're really great because every year we have this internal workshop that's only for statisticians and methodologists. Tracy's been often. And what you do is we have people from the FDA, we have people from the NH, we have just people that have these data dumps of clinical trials like NRS, and then these observational datas, and you have all the tool and the patient organizations, and you have industry partners that are there for observational purposes. You have all the nuts and bolts to really kind of make that work. And I think that if you find these types of, and it's very exclusive. I mean, these what goes in the conference is not shared to external partners, so it's very closed. And I think if you have these types of mechanisms to get this, started, I mean, that's where the conversation I think should probably begin. And I think HIV would be a great starting point because at least, you have everything there, really. I'm excited to collaborate if that's a possibility. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Anders. And then, you just mentioned Tracy Glass, if you would like to go next. Thank you.
Sure. I found this conversation very inspiring for things that have been bothering me for a long time about my own trials. What would have happened if, did we get the right answer, if we considered this or that, and all the data that was collected and not used? So I've really struggled with that research waste, with that really questioning about the complexity and kind of, these pragmatic trials, they're big and they're very, there's a lot of elements, a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of things that I would like to go back. So I have kind of motivated in a personal level to work on, as Eoin said, parts of the engine, which together would make the whole fantastic, but each has its own parts. And of course, very motivated by the idea of starting somewhere. So where could we get a viable disease area option and just have conversations like this, where you're just kind of slowly moving the conversation and the actual output forward. And I think it's really, when you have the different type of people with the different backgrounds and expertise, it's really very interesting to be part of. And I think this is where things are heading. So I really appreciate your forward thinking, Michaela, on this topic.
Thank you so much for being here as well. And Parashkev, you would be next.
I think we're clear that the principles of Michaela's vision cannot be denied. We need to bring better information, better intelligence to the process of carrying out R&D, and that, for obvious reasons, should be distributed across the whole process. So it makes perfect sense. I think the challenge now is implementation. How do we implement it? And in particular, how we can build systems that will be very heavy from a computational perspective. We're going to build these things with sufficient expressivity and sufficient capacity to be able to do all of these tasks. We need the right kind of infrastructure. And in particular, we need to not only collect data at scale, but also data that runs across multiple compartments. Trials are different from real-world data and so on. And building systems that can span these currently siloed areas is not easy. And what we need actually is help from governments, from regulators, to encourage that process, because at the moment there is a great deal of resistance to it. A good example is how hard it is to obtain data, even under a perfectly clear ethical guidance inside hospitals. That's hard enough as it is. And so I think thinking about how we arrive at an implementation of these ideas is the main challenge now, and the considerable changes that need to happen, political, more than anything else, in order for us to achieve it.
Thank you so much for adding that perspective as well. And then Richard Peck would be the last panelist. Thank you so much for being here as well.
So the advantage is Justine knows of going last is that everyone's already said everything. What's encouraging for me, what's really encouraging for me is actually there's quite a lot of discussion about how do we go forward, because otherwise it would have been an interesting intellectual debate and of no practical value whatsoever. And I'm very encouraged that there are already some practical suggestions of how to move forward, and whether it's whichever disease area. I mean, there are some options. HIV was mentioned. Susan, I haven't forgotten Susan Galbraith's comment about Friends of Cancer Research and or other potential safe harbor type places or catalysts that can help move something forward. So I think there are some ideas there. It can also work, I guess, that pieces get worked on by different champions in maybe different areas, and then they can share the knowledge and bring something together to a greater whole. But what's going to be critical is that there are champions who actually want to put the time and effort into moving this forward and can see a way to do that. And I get the sense that there are some people like that around this video conference, and I'm sure we'll find others. So it's encouraging. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you again, everyone, for contributing to the panel discussion and for sharing your thoughts and questions in the Q&A chat as well. Before you all leave, I would like to announce a couple of things. First of all, our next session, which is going to run in the second quarter of 2026, is going to be on AI for translational biomedical research. And we'll talk about machine learning and how it can move beyond prediction to support more mechanistic disease modeling. We'll capture some thoughts about multiomics and clinical data, how we can use them to uncover causal structures, model molecular interactions, and disease dynamics. Please also do provide us with any feedback about this new format with longer sessions by sending us an email or letting us know via LinkedIn. And this session and its recording will be up on YouTube soon. Again, please let colleagues know about these sessions. They're free to attend for any clinician, such that the community grows and gets bigger. And thanks again for being here today. Thanks again to the panel. It was a really exciting discussion, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.